Sometimes the greatest acts of courage come from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Sometimes the most broken hearts find healing in unexpected places. In the town of Dry Creek, two ragged twin girls were pushed toward horses as a cruel joke. Everyone expected them to fail. Instead, they rode with such grace that the entire crowd fell silent. The weathered cowboy who brought them, Maddox Thorne, had found these girls half-starved and alone. He saw something special in them that others missed. But when their incredible riding skill catches the attention of powerful men, Maddox must face his own painful past to keep them safe. What secret were these girls hiding that made them ride like angels? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Dry Creek, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. Dust motes danced in the slanted light, carrying the scent of horse leather and prairie grass through the still air. It was the kind of morning that made a man remember why he'd fallen in love with the frontier in the first place, before life had taught him that beauty and heartbreak often walked hand in hand. Maddox Thorne sat on the porch of Henderson's General Store, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had grown cold an hour ago. The tarnished Trail Scout badge in his shirt pocket pressed against his ribs with each breath, a reminder of the man he used to be. 20 years of guiding wagon trains through hostile territory, 20 years of bringing families safely to their promised land. Then one terrible day when his own family needed protecting, and he'd failed them completely. The badge felt heavier this morning, though he couldn't say why. Across the street, two small figures huddled together on the church steps. Their clothes little more than patched rags held together by determination. The twin girls couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13, with tangled dark hair that caught the morning light like spun copper. They'd appeared 3 days ago at the edge of town, silent as shadows and twice as skittish. Nobody knew where they'd come from. Nobody much cared to ask. Maddox had found them that first night, shivering behind Morton's livery stable, picking through scraps the horses had left behind. Something in their eyes, a mixture of fierce pride and desperate hunger, had reminded him of a pair of wild colts he'd once gentled on the trail. Creatures that had known kindness once, but learned to expect cruelty. He'd taken them to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, paid for a room and 3 meals a day. Mrs. Patterson had clucked her tongue and muttered about charity cases, but she'd fed them well enough. The girls hadn't spoken a word to anyone, not even to each other where others could hear. But sometimes, in the early morning light, Maddox caught them whispering together in voices soft as prairie wind. "Still watching over your strays, Thorne?" The voice belonged to Vernon Kemp, the town's self-appointed moral authority, and owner of the largest cattle spread in 3 counties. Kemp climbed the porch steps with the measured stride of a man accustomed to having others move out of his way. His silver-trimmed boots caught the morning light, a stark contrast to Maddox's worn leather. "Just enjoying the morning," Maddox said, not looking up from his cold coffee. "Those girls been causing talk." Kemp settled into the chair beside him without invitation, his bulk making the wood creak in protest. "Folks wondering why a washed-up trail scout's taking such interest in a pair of vagrant children." Maddox finally raised his eyes, meeting Kemp's gaze with the steady calm that had once made hostile tribes think twice about attacking his wagon trains. "Folks in this town seem to find plenty to talk about." "Indeed they do." Kemp pulled out a silver pocket watch, checking the time with theatrical precision. "Speaking of which, you planning to bring those girls to the Frontier Fair this afternoon? There's been some discussion about having them participate in the festivities." The way Kemp said participate made Maddox's jaw tighten. He'd heard about Dry Creek's version of Frontier festivities. The annual fair had become less about celebrating their heritage and more about providing entertainment for the town's crueler impulses. Last year, they'd made old Pete Rawlins dance for whiskey money until he collapsed from exhaustion. The year before, they'd convinced a traveling preacher to baptize Widow Murphy's pig, while the whole town laughed themselves sick. Not sure they'd be interested, Maddox said carefully. Oh, I think they might surprise you. Kemp's smile held all the warmth of a January blizzard. Young ladies their age, they need to learn about community participation, integration. Can't have them growing up thinking they're separate from the rest of us decent folk. Across the street, the twins had risen from the church steps and were walking toward the livery stable. Even from a distance, Maddox could see the grace in their movements, the way they seemed to float rather than walk. There was something about them that reminded him of his wife, Mary, not in their appearance, but in an indefinable quality of strength wrapped in gentleness. Mary had possessed that same quality, right up until the fever took her and their unborn child. Maddox's hand moved instinctively to his shirt pocket, where he kept the faded photograph of Mary astride her favorite mare. She'd been the finest rider he'd ever known. With hands so gentle, she could calm the most fractious horse with nothing but whispered words and patient touch. Fair starts at 2 o'clock, Kemp continued, rising from his chair with obvious satisfaction. I do hope you'll encourage the girls to join us. It would be such a shame if they missed the opportunity to show the community what they're made of. After Kemp left, Maddox remained on the porch, watching the twins disappear into the shadows between buildings. He understood now why the badge had felt heavier this morning. Some instinct, honed by years on the trail, was warning him that trouble was coming, sure as storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The frontier fair had always brought out the worst in people. Something about the crowd, the whiskey, and the excuse to call cruelty entertainment turned otherwise decent folks into something meaner. Maddox had seen it happen in towns across the territory. Good people losing themselves in the mob's laughter, while someone else's dignity got trampled in the dust. But there was something else troubling him, something beyond Kemp's obvious intentions. In the 3 days since the girls had arrived, Maddox had noticed things. Small things that might not mean anything, or might mean everything. The way they moved, for instance. Despite their ragged appearance and obvious hunger, they carried themselves with an unconscious elegance that spoke of better times. Their hands, though dirty and scratched, were small-boned and graceful, not the rough, calloused hands of children raised to hard labor. And their speech, in the few words he'd overheard them whisper to each other, carried the cadence of education and refinement. Most telling of all was their reaction to horses. While most children their age might be cautious or frightened around the large animals, these girls showed no fear whatsoever. Yesterday, he'd watched one of them calm a spooked gelding simply by approaching with empty hands and speaking in tones too soft for him to hear. The horse had gentled immediately, as if recognizing something familiar in her presence. Maddox drained the last of his cold coffee and stood, decision crystallizing in his mind like frost on a window pane. Whatever Vernon Kemp and his cronies had planned for the frontier fair, they wouldn't be using these girls as entertainment. Not if he had anything to say about it. But first, he needed to understand more about who these children really were. The abandoned mining camp, where he'd first spotted them, lay half a day's ride to the north, a place that had been deserted for the better part of 5 years. No reason for 2 young girls to be there unless they were running from something or someone. As he walked toward the livery stable to saddle his horse, Maddox's hand brushed against the trail scout badge in his pocket. For the first time in years, it felt like it belonged there. Maybe it was time to remember what it meant to be a protector instead of just a survivor. The twins were nowhere to be seen when he reached the stable, but their presence lingered in the way the horses stood calmer in their stalls, ears pricked forward with interest rather than wariness. Jake Morrison, the stable-keeper, nodded toward the back of the building. "Those girls you've been looking after," Morrison said, pitching his voice low. "They've got away with the animals, I'll give them that. Been coming by each morning, just standing quiet-like among the horses. Never seen anything quite like it. They say anything to you." "Not much." "But I heard them talking to the horses." Morrison shook his grizzled head in wonder. "Strangest thing, it was almost like the horses understood every word. Maddox found them in the rear paddock, standing motionless beside a black mare that had a reputation for meanness. The horse's head was lowered, her muzzle resting gently against the smaller girl's shoulder, while the other twin stroked her neck with practiced ease. "She's beautiful," one of them said softly, her voice carrying the same musical quality Maddox had noticed before. "Papa always said black horses were the smartest," the other replied, and something in her tone made Maddox's chest tighten with recognition of profound loss. They weren't just orphans. They were mourning their father. He cleared his throat gently, not wanting to startle them or the horse. Both girls turned toward him with identical expressions of wariness, but they didn't run. After 3 days of patient kindness, he'd earned at least that much trust. "You ladies know much about horses?" he asked, keeping his voice casual and unthreatening. The girls exchanged a look that spoke of shared secrets and careful decisions. Finally, the taller one, he thought of her as the protector, always positioned slightly in front of her sister, nodded slowly. "Our papa taught us," she said. "Before he went away, before he died," Maddox corrected silently. These children had learned to speak in careful euphemisms, probably from necessity. "Well," Maddox said, stepping closer to the paddock fence, "there's going to be some folks this afternoon who think they know about horses too. They might want to see what you ladies can do." The fear that flashed across both their faces told him everything he needed to know about their past experiences. "With adult expectations, we don't have to go anywhere we don't want to," the smaller girl said. But there was a question in her statement, as if she wasn't entirely sure of the truth of it. "No," Maddox said firmly, meaning every word. "You surely don't. But sometimes, when people are looking for trouble, the best thing to do is show them they've picked the wrong folks to mess with." He thought of Mary then, how she'd faced down a pack of wolves with nothing but her horse's speed and her own unshakable confidence. Sometimes the best defense was a good offense. And these girls, whatever secrets they carried, deserved to know they had someone in their corner. The afternoon sun was already climbing toward its zenith, and soon the streets would fill with fair-goers looking for entertainment. Maddox made his decision. "If you ladies are willing," he said, "I think it might be time to show this town what real horsemanship looks like." The Dry Creek Frontier Fair had transformed the town square into a carnival of dust and noise. Makeshift booths lined the perimeter, selling everything from ribbon candy to patent medicines guaranteed to cure whatever ailed a person. The air thick with the scent of roasting corn and the sound of fiddle music, punctuated by bursts of laughter that carried an edge of meanness. Maddox walked slowly through the crowd, the twin girls flanking him like small shadows. They'd cleaned up as best they could at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, but their patched dresses and worn shoes still marked them as outsiders in a town that valued appearances above kindness. He noticed how conversations died as they passed, how eyes followed their progress with a hungry anticipation. Of wolves scenting wounded prey, Vernon Kemp stood near the center of the square beside a makeshift corral that held 3 horses, a bucking bronco that had thrown every rider who'd tried him, a skittish paint mare, and an old sorrel gelding that looked gentle enough for children. A small crowd had already gathered, sensing entertainment in the offing. "Ah, Thorn!" Kemp's voice boomed across the square with theatrical enthusiasm. "And our young guests. How wonderful that you decided to join us for our little celebration." The way he said "young guests" made it clear he considered them anything but welcome. Maddox felt the girls press closer to his sides, and he rested a protective hand on each of their shoulders. "Afternoon, Kemp," Maddox replied evenly. "Fine day for a fair." "Indeed it is." Kemp's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "In fact, we were just discussing how the frontier spirit is all about rising to challenges, meeting adversity with courage and skill. Wouldn't you agree?" The crowd was growing now, drawn by the promise of spectacle. Maddox recognized most of the faces, shopkeepers and farmers, ranch hands and their wives, all decent enough people individually but capable of casual cruelty when caught up in mob mentality. Mrs. Patterson stood near the edge, wringing her hands with obvious discomfort. Jake Morrison leaned against a fence post, his expression troubled. "I reckon that depends on the challenge," Maddox said carefully. "Oh, nothing too demanding." Kemp gestured toward the corral with false casualness. "Simply thought our young friends here might enjoy demonstrating their equestrian abilities. After all, any child raised in this territory should know their way around a horse." The smaller twin, Maddox had started thinking of her as Grace, though he didn't know their real names, stepped forward slightly. Her chin was raised with the same defiant pride he'd seen that first night behind the livery stable. "We know horses," she said, her clear voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. "Excellent." Kemp clapped his hands together with exaggerated delight. "Then you won't mind giving us a little demonstration? Nothing fancy, you understand. Just a simple ride around the corral." Maddox felt the trap closing around them like morning fog. The 3 horses in the corral weren't chosen randomly. The bronco was a test no child should be expected to pass. The paint mare was known for her unpredictable temperament, and even the gentle sorrel could present challenges for inexperienced riders. Kemp was offering them a choice between humiliation and potential injury, probably hoping for both. "Might be better to start with something a bit easier," Maddox suggested. But Kemp was already shaking his head. "Nonsense. These are frontier girls, aren't they? Surely they're not afraid of a little challenge." He turned to address the crowd directly. "After all, we wouldn't want anyone thinking they're putting on airs, claiming abilities they don't possess." The murmur that ran through the gathered townspeople carried undertones of agreement. Maddox realized with growing anger that this wasn't just entertainment for them. It was a test of social hierarchy. The twins were being asked to prove they belonged, with failure meaning continued ostracism and success potentially bringing its own dangers. "Papa always said fear was just excitement wearing a mask," the taller girl said quietly. Her words meant for her sister, but clearly audible to those nearby. Grace nodded, a smile touching her lips for the first time since Maddox had known her. "And excitement means you're about to learn something new." Without waiting for further discussion, both girls slipped between the corral rails with fluid grace. The crowd pressed closer, anticipating either spectacular failure or at least some amusing stumbling. Even Maddox felt his breath catch as the twins approached the horses with unhurried confidence. The bronco snorted and tossed his head, muscles bunching beneath his dark coat as he sized up these small potential riders. The paint mare danced sideways, ears flicking nervously. Only the old sorrel stood calm. But even he watched the approaching girls with wary intelligence. Grace moved toward the bronco while her sister approached the paint mare. Neither girl showed the slightest hesitation or fear, and something in their bearing made the horses' aggressive postures begin to soften. Maddox watched in amazement as Grace extended her hand toward the bronco's muzzle, speaking in tones too soft for anyone else to hear. The horse that had thrown 3 grown men that afternoon lowered his head and allowed a 12-year-old girl to stroke his neck. "I'll be damned," someone whispered behind Maddox. The taller twin had similar success with the paint mare, her gentle touch seeming to dissolve the horse's nervousness like morning mist before sunlight. Within minutes, both girls had not only approached their chosen mounts, but were running their hands along flanks and legs, checking for soundness with the practiced eye of experienced horsewomen. Then came the silver bridle. Grace pulled it from beneath her patched dress, an ornate piece of tack unlike anything Maddox had seen in frontier territory. The metalwork was intricate, decorated with engravings that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in complex patterns. Even from a distance, he could tell it was crafted by master artisans, probably worth more than most folks in Dry Creek earned in a year. The crowd's murmur grew louder as Grace slipped the bridle over the bronco's head with practiced ease. The horse accepted it without resistance, as if he recognized the quality of the craftsmanship and the skill of the hands that wielded it. Her sister produced a matching bridle for the paint mare, and suddenly both girls were mounted bareback, with the fluid grace of dancers. Taking the stage, what happened next would be talked about in Dry Creek for years to come. The twins didn't simply ride the horses, they became one with them. Grace guided the bronco through a series of intricate maneuvers that showcased both her skill and the horse's natural athleticism. Tight circles, flying lead changes, backing and side passing with precision that would have impressed cavalry officers. The horse, that had been bucking and snorting minutes earlier, now moved like liquid poetry beneath her guidance. Her sister's performance with the paint mare was equally breathtaking. The nervous, skittish animal had transformed into a willing partner, executing spins and rollbacks with enthusiasm rather than fear. Both girls rode without saddles or reins, in the traditional sense, guiding their mounts through subtle shifts in weight and whispered commands that seemed to bypass the horses' minds and speak directly. To their hearts, the crowd had gone completely silent. When the demonstration ended, both girls slid from their mounts with the same fluid grace they'd shown in mounting. They stood beside their horses, hands resting on sleek necks, waiting for whatever judgment the crowd might render. The silver bridles caught the afternoon light like captured starlight, beautiful and somehow otherworldly in the dusty pragmatism of the frontier setting. Vernon Kemp was the first to break the spell, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Well," he said, the word falling into the silence like a stone into still water, "that was certainly unexpected." Maddox found himself studying the faces around him, watching as amazement gradually gave way to speculation. The twins had proven their abilities beyond any doubt, but he could see minds working behind the eyes of certain townspeople. The silver bridles alone raised questions about these girls' backgrounds, and their demonstrated skills suggested training that went far beyond frontier basics. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her earlier discomfort replaced by genuine admiration. "That was beautiful, girls. Just beautiful." But it was Jake Morrison who voiced what several others were clearly thinking. "Those bridles didn't come from any frontier saddle maker. That's Eastern craftsmanship, maybe even European." The questions had begun, and with them, a new kind of attention that might prove more dangerous than the mockery they'd initially faced. Maddox realized that in solving one problem, they'd created another. The twins' extraordinary abilities had protected them from humiliation, but they'd also revealed secrets that certain people would be very interested in exploring. As the crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzing with speculation and wonder, Maddox approached the girls. They were removing the silver bridles with careful reverence, tucking them back beneath their clothing like precious secrets returning to hiding. "You ladies did real fine," he said quietly, pride and concern warring in his voice. Grace looked up at him with eyes that seemed far older than her years. "Papa always said the truth comes out eventually. Might as well be on our terms." Her sister nodded, then added with quiet determination, "Besides, now they know we're not helpless." As they walked back toward Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, Maddox couldn't shake the feeling that the afternoon's demonstration had been more than just a display of horsemanship. It had been a declaration of war, subtle perhaps, but unmistakable to those who understood the language of power and possession. The twins had revealed they were far more than vagrant orphans, and in a territory where information was currency and secrets were leverage. That revelation would have consequences none of them could yet foresee. The leather journal felt heavy in Maddox's hands as he sat by the window in his small room above the blacksmith shop. The pages were worn soft from years of handling, filled with entries that chronicled the slow death of everything he'd once held dear. His handwriting had grown shakier over the years, but the pain in the words remained as sharp as the day he'd first written them. October 15th, 1887. Mary took fever in the night. Doc says it might be the influenza that's been going around, but she's carrying so strong, I fear for both of them. October 18th, 1887. Lost them both today. Mary went peaceful, but she knew. Could see it in her eyes at the end. She was sorry to leave me behind. He'd stopped writing for months after that, the grief too raw to put into words. When he'd finally picked up the pen again, it was to document his slow descent into the bottle and the steady dissolution of everything he'd built during 20 years as one of the territory's most trusted trail scouts. A soft knock at his door interrupted the familiar ritual of self-recrimination. When he opened it, Both twins stood in the hallway, their expressions serious beyond their years. "Mr. Thorne," Grace said formally, "we wanted to thank you for today. And to apologize." "Apologize." Maddox stepped back to let them enter, though his small room barely accommodated 3 people. "What for?" The taller girl, he'd started thinking of her as Hope, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, twisted her hands together nervously. "We didn't mean to cause you trouble. The bridles, the riding, we should have warned you." "Those bridles," Maddox said carefully, "they belong to your father." Both girls nodded, and Grace pulled the ornate piece of tack from beneath her dress. In the lamplight, the engravings were even more intricate than he'd realized, intertwining roses and thorns that spoke of master craftsmanship and significant expense. "Papa had them made special," Hope explained. "He said every horseman should have tools worthy of the partnership." "Your papa sounds like he was a wise man," Maddox said, settling into his chair and gesturing for the girls to sit on his narrow bed. "What happened to him?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Both girls looked at each other with the kind of wordless communication that only came from shared trauma. "There was sickness in the camp," Grace said finally. "Not just Papa, almost everyone. We tried to help, but we were too small, and there weren't enough medicines." "What kind of camp?" Maddox asked gently. "Mining camp," Hope replied. "Papa was the foreman. He knew about horses because he used to work for rich folks back east before Mama died, and we came out here." The pieces of their story were falling into place like cards dealt from a marked deck. A mining camp foreman would have had education and resources, explaining the girls' refined speech and their father's ability to afford such expensive tack. The isolation of mining operations would account for why no one had come looking for them when the sickness struck. "How long were you alone before I found you?" 3 weeks, Grace said quietly. "We buried Papa and the others as best we could, then stayed until the food ran out. 3 weeks. 2 children, barely into their teens, managing alone in a dead mining camp with nothing but their father's horses and their own courage to sustain them." Maddox felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since Mary's death, the fierce protectiveness that came from recognizing kindred spirits in need. "You did right coming to town," he said firmly. "And you did right today, showing them you're not to be trifled with. But now they'll ask questions," Hope said, voicing the concern that had been nagging at Maddox since the afternoon's demonstration. "Let them ask. Questions don't hurt nobody, and knowing you ladies can handle yourselves might make certain folks think twice about causing trouble." A commotion in the street below interrupted their conversation. Maddox moved to the window and peered down to see Vernon Kemp in heated discussion with 2 other men outside Henderson's general store. Even from a distance, their body language suggested they were planning something unpleasant. "You girls stay here," Maddox said, reaching for his hat. "I need to check on something," but Grace was already at the window, her face pale in the lamplight. "It's about us, isn't it?" "Maybe. Probably." There was no point in lying to children who'd already seen more of the world's cruelty than most adults. "But that's my concern, not yours. It became our concern the moment we showed them those bridles," Hope said with surprising firmness. "We are not helpless, Mr. Thorne. We proved that today." Before Maddox could object, both girls had slipped past him and were heading for the stairs. He caught up with them in the street, where their presence immediately drew attention from Kemp's group. "Ah, our young equestrians," Kemp called out, his voice carrying that same false joviality from the afternoon. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing your remarkable performance." Today, the 2 men with Kemp were strangers to Maddox, well-dressed, outsiders with the kind of soft hands and calculating eyes that suggested they made their living from other people's labor. One carried a leather satchel that looked expensive enough to feed a family for months. "Mr. Kemp," Grace said politely, "we're pleased you enjoyed the demonstration." "Enjoyed?" The man with the satchel stepped forward, his attention focused entirely on the girls. "My dear children, what you displayed today was nothing short of extraordinary. Allow me to introduce myself, Cornelius Blackwood, Talent Acquisitions. What kind of talent? Maddox interjected, not liking the predatory gleam in Blackwood's eyes. Equestrian entertainment, of course. Wild West shows are becoming quite popular in the eastern cities. Young ladies with your obvious abilities could earn substantial sums performing for appreciative audiences. The second stranger nodded enthusiastically. We're prepared to offer immediate employment, with transportation to Denver and eventually to shows in Chicago, New York, even Europe. Maddox felt the twins tense beside him. Hope's hand found Grace's, their fingers intertwining with the unconscious solidarity of children who'd learned to depend on each other for survival. That's generous, Maddox said carefully. But these girls aren't looking for employment. They're looking for a home. Nonsense, Kemp interrupted. Opportunity like this doesn't come along every day. These children should be grateful for the chance to make something of themselves. We're grateful, Grace said quietly. But we're not interested. Blackwood's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Perhaps you don't understand the full scope of what we're offering. Room and board, education, training with the finest horses money can buy. And what happens when they get hurt? Maddox cut him off. Or when they get too old to be novelties? You going to take care of them then? Mr. Thorne, isn't it? The second stranger finally spoke, his voice carrying the polished authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. Edmund Hayes, attorney, I think you may be overstepping your bounds here. These children have no legal guardian, which means they're free to make their own decisions about their futures. The trap was closing around them with professional efficiency. Maddox realized this conversation had been planned, probably from the moment the twins had finished their demonstration. Kemp had contacted these men describing what he'd seen, and they'd moved quickly to stake their claim. Actually, Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. That's not entirely accurate. All heads turned toward the boarding house keeper, who approached with a determined stride that suggested she'd been listening to more of the conversation than anyone had realized. I filed papers with Judge Morrison this afternoon, she continued, producing a folded document from her apron pocket. Temporary guardianship pending a proper hearing, which means any decisions about these girls' futures will be made by someone who has their best interests at heart, not someone looking to profit from their talents. The silence that followed was profound. Blackwood and Hayes exchanged glances that spoke of plans suddenly complicated by unexpected legal obstacles. Kemp's face had turned an interesting shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure was reaching dangerous levels. That's very touching. Ma'am, Hayes said finally, but temporary guardianship can be challenged, especially when it's not in the children's best interests to refuse such generous opportunities. Then I guess we'll let Judge Morrison decide what's best, Mrs. Patterson replied with serene confidence. Court's in session next Tuesday. As the confrontation dissolved into muttered promises of legal action and future discussions, Maddox found himself reassessing the quiet boarding house keeper who'd just thrown herself into the lion's den to protect two children she barely knew. Later, after Blackwood and Hayes had departed for their rooms at the town's only hotel, Maddox found Mrs. Patterson in her kitchen, brewing tea with hands that trembled slightly from delayed reaction to the evening's events. That was brave of you, he said quietly. That was necessary, she corrected. Those men looked at those girls like they were prize horses at auction. Made my skin crawl. The guardianship papers are real enough, though they might not hold up under serious legal challenge. She poured tea into 2 cups, adding honey with practiced efficiency. But they'll buy us time to figure out what's really going on here. What do you mean? Mrs. Patterson met his eyes with an expression that suggested she'd been thinking about this problem longer than anyone realized. Those bridles didn't come from any mining camp foreman's wages, Mr. Thorne, and girls don't learn to ride like that from casual instruction. Someone's not telling the whole truth about who these children really are. Outside, the sound of horses' hooves on hard-packed earth suggested that Blackwood and Hayes weren't planning to wait until Tuesday to advance their interests. The war for the twins' future had begun in earnest, and Maddox realized he was going to need allies if he hoped to keep them safe. Dawn came early to Dry Creek, painting the horizon in shades of rose and gold that reminded Maddox of better times. He'd spent most of the night keeping watch from his window, noting the comings and goings around the hotel where Blackwood and Hayes had taken rooms. 3 times during the night, riders had arrived and departed, suggesting the 2 men were building support for whatever they had planned. The twin Lockets caught the morning light as Grace and Hope sat on the boarding house porch, whispering together in voices too soft for him to hear. The delicate silver pieces seemed out of place against their patched dresses. Another piece of the puzzle that suggested these girls came from circumstances far different from their current appearance. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of biscuits and preserves, her movements brisk with purpose. "Eat up, girls. Going to be a long day, and you'll need your strength. Any word from Judge Morrison?" Maddox asked, accepting the coffee she offered with grateful hands. "He'll see us this morning, before the regular court session. Won't be formal, just a chance for him to meet the girls and understand the situation." She lowered her voice as the twins focused on their breakfast. "But I got word from my cousin who works at the hotel. Those men have been sending telegrams half the night. Seems they're bringing in reinforcements." The implications settled in Maddox's stomach like cold lead. Professional talent scouts didn't usually travel with legal teams unless they expected significant resistance to their acquisitions. Whatever Blackwood and Hayes really represented, it was larger and more organized than a simple Wild West show recruitment. Morning. "Folks." Sheriff Tom Bradley approached the porch with the measured pace of a man carrying uncomfortable news. He'd been a good lawman for 15 years, fair and honest. But he also understood the political realities of a small frontier town where economic influence often trumped simple justice. "Sheriff?" Mrs. Patterson replied coolly. "Bit early for social calls, isn't it? Got a complaint filed this morning. Seems those gentlemen from back east are claiming interference with their business interests." Bradley's expression suggested he found the complaint as distasteful as everyone else, but was bound by duty to address it. "They're saying the girls entered into verbal agreements yesterday that are being unlawfully obstructed." Grace looked up from her biscuit, her young face set with determination that reminded Maddox powerfully of his late wife. "We never agreed to anything, Sheriff Bradley. They made offers, but we said no. That's what I figured, miss, but they've got a lawyer says different, and he's got papers from Denver backing up his authority to investigate what he calls impediments to interstate commerce." Bradley removed his hat, running fingers through graying hair. "I'm not saying I believe it, but I got to follow proper procedure." "What kind of procedure?" Maddox asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Got to ask the girls some questions, official-like, and I got to examine any evidence related to their background and circumstances." Hope's hand moved instinctively to the locket at her throat, a gesture that didn't escape the sheriff's notice. "These lockets belong to us, Sheriff. They're all we have left of our mama. I'm sure they are." "Miss, but if those gentlemen are claiming you ladies have assets that might affect your legal status, I got to at least look at what you're carrying." Mrs. Patterson stepped protectively closer to the girls. "Tom Bradley, you've known these children all of 3 days. And already you're treating them like criminals." "I'm treating them like citizens who deserve proper legal protection," Bradley replied firmly, "which means following the law, even when I don't like it much." With obvious reluctance, both girls removed their lockets, placing them gently in the sheriff's outstretched palm. Bradley opened them with careful reverence, and his expression changed as he studied the miniature portraits inside. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, then caught himself and apologized for the language. "Sorry, ladies. It's just, these are professional portraits. High-quality work, probably costs more than most folks around here make in a year." Maddox leaned closer to examine the locket's contents. The portraits showed a woman of refined beauty, dressed in clothing that spoke of wealth and education. But it was her expression that caught his attention, the same quiet strength he'd seen in both girls. The same defiant pride that had carried them through hardship and loss. "That's our mama," Grace said simply. "Charlotte Ashworth. Papa said she was the finest lady in all of Virginia before she married him and came west. Ashworth. Bradley repeated the name slowly, as if testing its weight. The name sounds familiar. Seems like I heard it somewhere recently. Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to Main Street. A small cavalcade was approaching, Blackwood and Hayes in a rented buggy, followed by 3 riders who had the look of professional enforcers rather than cowboys. Behind them came Vernon Kemp on his prize stallion, his presence lending local authority to whatever the Easterners had planned. Looks like the morning's entertainment is about to begin, Mrs. Patterson observed dryly. The group pulled up in front of the boarding house with theatrical precision. Blackwood descended from the buggy with the satisfied air of a man whose plans were proceeding according to schedule. "Sheriff Bradley," he called out in a voice pitched to carry to the growing crowd of curious townspeople. "I trust you've had time to examine the evidence we discussed?" "Still looking into things, Mr. Blackwood. These matters take time to sort out properly." Of course. But surely you can see that these children are carrying items of considerable value. Items that raise questions about their true circumstances and legal status." Hayes produced a sheaf of papers from his leather case. "We've taken the liberty of researching the Ashworth family name. Quite interesting reading, I assure you. The trap was closing with legal precision, but Maddox couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than simple exploitation. The speed with which Blackwood and Hayes had moved, the resources they'd brought to bear on what should have been a simple recruitment, the emphasis on the girls' true circumstances, it all suggested they knew something about the twins that even the girls themselves might not understand. "Perhaps," Hayes continued, "it would be helpful if these young ladies could tell us about their father's business at the mining camp. Specifically his relationship with the Ashworth Mining Consortium." The blood drained from both girls' faces. Hope's hand found Grace's, their fingers intertwining with the desperate strength of children who suddenly understood they were in far deeper waters than they'd realized. "We don't know anything about any consortium," Grace said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Really?" Blackwood smiled with the satisfaction of a card player laying down a winning hand. "Then perhaps you can explain why your late father was listed as the primary beneficiary of a considerable trust fund established by the late Mrs. Charlotte Ashworth of Richmond, Virginia. A trust fund that, according to our research, would now pass to her surviving heirs." The revelation hung in the morning air like gun smoke after a battle. Maddox realized that everything they'd assumed about the twins' circumstances had been wrong. These weren't just orphaned daughters of a mining camp foreman. They were heiresses to what might be a substantial fortune, which explained the professional interest in their recruitment. "I think," Sheriff Bradley said slowly, "we'd better continue this discussion in my office." "All of us?" As the group prepared to relocate to the jailhouse for what promised to be a very revealing conversation, Maddox caught Mrs. Patterson's eye. Her expression mirrored his own growing concern. The twins weren't just fighting for their freedom anymore. They were fighting for their lives, their future, and an inheritance that powerful men were clearly determined to control. The war had escalated beyond simple custody to something far more dangerous, and Maddox realized that his old trail scout skills were about to be tested in ways he'd never expected. Protecting wagon trains from hostile tribes had been simple compared to protecting 2 young girls from men who killed with legal documents instead of bullets. The deed papers crinkled like autumn leaves as Sheriff Bradley spread them across his desk, the faded ink and official seals telling a story that none of them had expected to hear. The cramped office felt even smaller with so many people crowded inside, Maddox and Mrs. Patterson flanking the twins like protective bookends, while Blackwood, Hayes, and Kemp occupied the chairs across from Bradley's desk with the satisfied air of hunters who'd finally cornered their prey. "According to these documents," Bradley said slowly, his finger tracing the legal text, "the Ashworth Mining Consortium owned mineral rights to approximately 15,000 acres in the Northern Territory, including the camp where you girls were living." Grace and Hope sat perfectly still, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles had gone white. Maddox could see them trying to process information that would have challenged adults twice their age. The consortium was dissolved 5 years ago, Hayes added helpfully, following the death of Mrs. Charlotte Ashworth and the subsequent legal complications surrounding the inheritance. However, the trust fund she established for her descendants remained intact, administered by a bank in Denver. "How much money are we talking about?" Mrs. Patterson asked bluntly, though her protective posture suggested she already suspected the answer would complicate everything. Blackwood consulted his notes with theatrical precision. The initial trust was established at $50,000, with accumulated interest over the past 15 years, bringing the total to approximately $75,000. Plus the mineral rights, which recent geological surveys suggest might be worth considerably more. The sum hit the room like a physical blow. $75,000 was more money than anyone in Dry Creek had ever seen, enough to buy half the town and still have change left over. Maddox felt his protective instincts shift into something deeper and more desperate. These girls weren't just orphans anymore. They were walking treasure chests, and everyone in the territory would soon know it. Of course, Hayes continued smoothly, accessing those funds requires proper legal representation and guardian advocacy. The bank won't release money to minor children without appropriate oversight. Oversight meaning you, Maddox said, not bothering to hide the contempt in his voice. We represent clients who specialize in managing complex inheritances involving minor beneficiaries, Hayes replied with professional calm. Our services include legal representation, financial management, and career development designed to maximize the long-term value of inherited assets. Career development, Hope repeated slowly, the phrase sounding foreign in her young voice. You mean the Wild West shows? Among other opportunities, yes. Young ladies with your obvious talents could earn substantial performance fees while their inheritance grows under professional management. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. Sheriff Bradley leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. These girls got any family left? Anyone with legal standing to speak for them? According to our research, Blackwood said, producing another set of papers, their father was Charlotte Ashworth's only surviving child, making these young ladies the sole remaining heirs. No living relatives. No previous guardianship arrangements, except for the temporary papers Mrs. Patterson filed, Maddox pointed out, which, as we discussed, can be challenged on grounds of insufficient relationship and questionable motivation. Hayes smiled with the cold efficiency of a man accustomed to dismantling other people's legal protections. A boarding house keeper with no previous connection to the children cannot reasonably claim priority over professional management services. The trap was tightening with legal precision. But Maddox could see something in the twins' expressions that suggested they weren't as helpless as everyone assumed. Grace caught his eye and nodded slightly toward the door, while Hope's attention seemed focused on something beyond the immediate conversation. "Sheriff Bradley," Grace said quietly, "might we have a moment to discuss this situation privately? Just the four of us who were here first." The request was reasonable enough, but something in her tone made Maddox pay closer attention. Both girls had straightened in their chairs, and their earlier fear had been replaced by a calculating stillness that reminded him of seasoned poker players studying their cards. "I think that's fair," Bradley agreed. "Gentlemen, if you'd give us a few minutes." Blackwood and Hayes exchanged glances that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable leaving their quarry unsupervised, but they couldn't reasonably object to the girls having private counsel. After they'd departed, followed by Vernon Kemp's reluctant bulk, the office felt noticeably less oppressive. "All right, ladies," Bradley said gently. "What's on your minds?" Grace reached beneath her dress and withdrew a folded paper that Maddox hadn't seen before, older and more worn than the official documents they'd been reviewing. "Sheriff, do you know how to read surveyor's marks?" "Some. Depends what kind of survey we're talking about. The kind that shows property boundaries and mineral claim stakes." Grace unfolded the paper. revealing a hand-drawn map covered with careful notations in what appeared to be her father's handwriting. Papa wasn't just the foreman at that mining camp. He was surveying new territory for the consortium, looking for expansion opportunities. Hope leaned forward, her voice carrying an excitement that hadn't been there moments before. He found something, Sheriff. Something big enough that men came from back east to talk to him about it. Just before the sickness started, Maddox studied the map, recognizing the careful precision of a man who understood that accuracy could mean the difference between wealth and worthlessness. The notation showed claim boundaries, geological formations, and what appeared to be test excavation sites scattered across a territory much larger than the 15,000 acres mentioned in the legal documents. Papa told us if anything ever happened to him, we should remember that the real treasure wasn't what was already claimed, but what was still waiting to be found. Grace's finger traced a series of marks along what appeared to be a creek bed. He said the consortium only owned the old claims, but the new discoveries would belong to whoever filed first. Mrs. Patterson was the first to understand the implications. You're saying there's more mining territory out there unclaimed? Not just more territory, Hope corrected. Better territory. Papa found a gold vein that runs for miles along Bear Creek, plus silver deposits that make the old claims look like pocket change. The revelation reframed everything they'd been discussing. If the girl's father had discovered significant mineral deposits on unclaimed land, the inheritance they were fighting over might be just the beginning. More importantly, those discoveries might explain why Blackwood and Hayes had moved so quickly to establish control over the girls. You think those men know about your papa's discoveries? Bradley asked. We think Papa sent reports to the consortium before he died, Grace replied. Reports that someone else probably read after the consortium was dissolved. Which means, Maddox added grimly, they're not just after the money in that bank account. They're after information that could make them rich beyond anything we've discussed. A commotion outside the office interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Maddox could see a crowd gathering around a man on horseback, someone who'd ridden hard and fast. Judging by his lathered mount and dust-covered clothes, Bradley opened the door to hear what was being shouted in the street. The rider's words carried clearly in the afternoon air. Federal marshals coming up from Denver. Whole troop of them moving fast. The news hit their small group like cold water. Federal involvement meant the situation had escalated beyond local jurisdiction, probably triggered by telegrams from powerful Eastern interests. Whatever window they'd had for finding a local solution was closing fast. Girls, Maddox said urgently, how much do you trust me? Both twins met his eyes without hesitation. Completely, Grace said. Then we need to get to that mining camp tonight before anyone else figures out what your papa found. Because once those federal marshals arrive, this whole situation is going to be taken out of all our hands. Mrs. Patterson was already moving toward her coat. I'll pack supplies. Sheriff, you going to try to stop us? Bradley looked out at the crowd in the street, then back at the map spread across his desk. After a long moment, he reached for his gun belt. No, ma'am. I think I'm going to help. Outside, the sound of approaching horses suggested their time for planning was over. The real fight for the twins' future was about to begin, and it would be decided not in courtrooms or legal documents, but in the harsh country where their father had died, protecting secrets that might be worth more than anyone yet realized. The cavalry saber felt unfamiliar in Maddox's hands after so many years, its weight a reminder of the man his father had been and the legacy he'd tried to live up to. The weapon had belonged to Captain William Thorne of the 7th Cavalry, who'd carried it through 3 Indian campaigns and 2 territorial wars before passing it on to his son, with the admonition that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Tonight, as Maddox prepared for what might be his last stand, he understood what his father had meant. The small group had gathered in Mrs. Patterson's kitchen as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Dry Creek's dusty streets. Through the window, they could see increased activity around the hotel, more horses, more men, and the kind of purposeful movement that suggested preparations for something significant. "Federal marshals should be here by morning," Sheriff Bradley reported, checking his pocket watch with nervous precision. "Maybe sooner, depending on how hard they're pushing their horses." Grace and Hope sat at the kitchen table, studying their father's map with the intense concentration of generals planning a campaign. Both girls had changed, from their patched dresses into more practical, riding clothes borrowed from Mrs. Patterson's storage, clothes that had belonged to her own daughter before consumption claimed. Another young life on the frontier, the main trail to the mining. "Camp is too exposed," Grace said, her finger tracing routes across the hand-drawn map. "But Papa showed us a back way, following Bear Creek up through the canyon. It's harder traveling, but it'll keep us hidden from anyone following the main road." "How long to reach the camp?" Maddox asked. 6 hours hard riding, maybe 7 if we have to go careful around the rocky sections." Hope looked up from the map, her young face set with determination that reminded him powerfully of soldiers he'd known, who faced impossible odds with quiet courage. "But once we're there, we'll have advantages. Papa built that camp to be defensible, and we know every hiding place." Mrs. Patterson finished packing the last of their supplies, hardtack, jerky, ammunition, and medical supplies wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry. "Tom Bradley, you sure about this? Once you ride out with us, there's no going back to being neutral." The sheriff adjusted his gun belt, the leather creaking with familiar authority. "Been neutral too long already. Time I remembered what this badge is supposed to mean." A soft knock at the back door interrupted their preparations. Everyone froze, hands moving instinctively toward weapons, until they heard Sarah Mitchell's familiar voice calling softly through the wooden panel. "Mrs. Patterson." "It's Sarah. I need to speak with you, privately." Sarah was the school teacher, a young woman who'd come west 3 years ago to bring education to frontier children. She'd been quietly supportive of the twins since their arrival, but her presence now suggested complications they hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Patterson cracked the door open cautiously. "Sarah, what brings you here so late?" "I overheard something at the hotel," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Those Eastern men, they've been sending telegrams all evening. I couldn't hear everything, but they mentioned something about eliminating complications and permanent solutions." The words hit the small group like physical blows. Maddox felt his grip tighten on the saber's hilt as the implications became clear. Blackwood and Hayes weren't just planning to control the twins' inheritance. They were planning to eliminate any obstacles to their acquisition permanently. "How many men do they have?" Bradley asked quietly. "At least a dozen that I could see, maybe more. And they're not just business associates." Sarah's voice carried the fear of someone who'd recognized professional violence beneath civilized facades. "These are hard men, Sheriff. The kind that solve problems with bullets instead of legal briefs." Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "They're not going to stop, are they? Not ever." "Even if we give them what they want, they'll never be satisfied because we'll always know too much." Her sister nodded grimly. "Papa used to say that some men see other people as obstacles instead of human beings. He said the only way to deal with men like that was to make sure they understood the cost of their choices." Maddox studied both girls, seeing in their expressions a hardness that spoke of lessons learned in the harshest classroom imaginable. They'd survived their father's death, weeks alone in a dead mining camp, and the constant threat of exploitation since arriving in Dry Creek. Whatever innocence they might have possessed had been burned away by necessity, leaving behind something stronger and more dangerous. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. "We're thinking it's time to stop running," Hope said with calm finality. "Papa always said the best defense was to make the other fellow worry about defending himself." Before anyone could object, Grace had moved to the window and was studying the street with tactical awareness that would have impressed seasoned soldiers. "They're watching the main roads, but they don't know about the back trails. If we can reach the mining camp without being followed, we can fort up there and make them come to us on ground we choose." "That's a dangerous game, girls," Bradley warned. "Those men have resources we can't match, but they don't have knowledge we can't match." Grace replied. They're fighting for money. We're fighting for our lives. Papa always said that made all the difference. Sarah Mitchell stepped fully into the kitchen, closing the door behind her with quiet determination. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not, Maddox said immediately. This isn't your fight, and it's going to be dangerous. Those girls need someone who understands legal documents and can bear witness to what happens. Besides, she added with a smile that held more steel than anyone had expected, I didn't come west to teach children how to pass sentences. I came to help them learn how to stand up for themselves. The plan that emerged from their hurried discussion was desperate but sound. They would leave immediately, using the cover of darkness to reach the mining camp via the hidden trail. Once there, they would fortify their position and send word to the territorial government, bypassing the federal marshals who might already be compromised by Eastern influence. More importantly, they would search the camp for whatever evidence the twins' father had left behind, documentation of his mineral, discoveries that might be valuable enough to negotiate from a position of strength rather than weakness. As they prepared to depart, Maddox pulled the twins aside for a final conversation. Ladies, I need you to understand something. Once we ride out of here, we're committed. There won't be any backing down or changing our minds. Both girls nodded solemnly. We understand, Mr. Thorne, but we also understand something else. Grace's hand moved to the locket at her throat, fingers tracing the silver surface with reverent care. Our mama didn't run from difficult men, and neither did Papa. They stood their ground and fought for what was right, even when it cost them everything. And now it's our turn, Hope added quietly. We're not going to dishonor their memory by giving up now. As the small group slipped out of Dry Creek under cover of darkness, following game trails that would hide their passage from watching eyes, Maddox felt the weight of his father's saber at his side like a benediction. Some things were indeed worth fighting for, and sometimes the fight chose you whether you were ready or not. Behind them, the lights of the hotel burned bright against the night sky, and Maddox knew that by morning, their absence would trigger a manhunt that would determine not just the twins' future, but whether justice could still find a foothold in a territory increasingly dominated by men who measured worth in dollars rather than dignity. The hidden will and testament lay beneath a loose floorboard in what had been the mining camp's administrative office, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax that had somehow survived 5 years of mountain weather. Grace's hands trembled as she lifted the document from its hiding place, her father's careful handwriting still legible in the flickering lamplight. They'd reached the abandoned camp just before dawn, their horses exhausted from the treacherous night ride through Bear Creek Canyon. The buildings stood like silent sentinels against the mountain backdrop, their weathered wood and broken windows testament to dreams that had died with the people who'd built them. But the camp's defensive position was everything Hope had promised, high, ground with clear sightlines and multiple escape routes, through terrain that would challenge anyone unfamiliar with the territory. Papa always said if something happened to him, the real truth would be hidden, where only we would think to look, Grace whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of grief and anticipation. Maddox held the lamp steady as she unfolded the document, revealing not just a will, but a comprehensive letter that began to reshape everything they thought they knew about the twins' situation. My dearest daughters, the letter began in their father's familiar script. If you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and the men I trusted have proven themselves to be something else entirely. Sarah Mitchell leaned closer, her teacher's instincts engaged by the formal language and legal terminology. This isn't just a personal letter. It's a legal document properly witnessed and notarized. Sheriff Bradley nodded grimly. Keep reading. I got a feeling this is about to explain a lot of things. The Ashworth Mining Consortium was never what it appeared to be, the letter continued. Your mother's family didn't die in accidents, as I told the authorities. They were murdered by men who wanted control of mining rights that stretched across 3 territories. Your mother discovered the truth before she died, and she made me promise to protect you from the same fate. Mrs. Patterson's sharp intake of breath echoed through the small room. Dear God, those girls' entire family was killed. Grace's voice was steady, despite the tears streaming down her face as she continued reading aloud. The man calling himself Edmund Hayes is not a lawyer. His real name is Edmund Ashworth, your mother's younger brother, who was presumed dead in a railroad accident 15 years ago. He's been systematically eliminating family members to consolidate control of the inheritance. Using legal manipulation and, when necessary, more direct methods, the revelation hit the group like a physical blow. Maddox felt his hand move instinctively to his saber hilt as the implications became clear. Hayes wasn't just trying to exploit the twins, he was their uncle, a man who'd apparently spent years orchestrating the deaths of his own family members. The mining consortium was dissolved when I discovered Edmund's involvement in your grandfather's death, the letter revealed. But by then, he'd already established himself in Denver's legal community under his assumed identity, building the network he'd need to claim the remaining assets when the time was right. Hope took the letter from her sister's trembling hands, her young voice carrying unnatural calm as she read the next section. Cornelius Blackwood is Edmund's partner and enforcer, a man with connections to criminal organizations in Chicago and New York. Together, they've been eliminating obstacles to their control of the Ashworth fortune, which includes not just the trust fund, but mineral rights worth potentially millions of dollars. Millions, Sheriff Bradley repeated weakly. We're not talking about 75,000 anymore. The geological surveys I conducted revealed gold and silver deposits that dwarf anything previously discovered in the territory, the letter explained. But the claims are structured in such a way that only direct descendants of Charlotte Ashworth can inherit them. Edmund needs you girls alive long enough to sign transfer documents, but once those papers are executed, you become liabilities he cannot afford to leave breathing. Sarah Mitchell was taking notes with the efficiency of someone accustomed to organizing complex information. This explains everything: the speed with which they responded to news of the girls, the legal resources they brought to bear, even the federal marshals. If they have connections in criminal organizations, they probably have contacts in government as well. There is evidence hidden in this camp that will prove Edmund's crimes. The letter continued, but it will only be valuable if it reaches honest authorities who cannot be bought or intimidated. Judge Harrison in Santa Fe is a man of integrity who knew your mother's family. He can be trusted to ensure justice is served. Maddox was already moving toward the door, his scout instincts warning him of approaching danger. We need to find that evidence fast. I can hear horses coming up the main trail, and they're not being subtle about it. Grace folded the letter carefully, tucking it inside her dress next to the silver locket. Papa hid things in the mine shaft itself, in a place he showed us but no one else knew about. But it'll take time to reach it and get back. Time we might not have, Mrs. Patterson observed, peering through a broken window at the dust cloud rising from the valley below. That's a lot of riders, and they're moving with purpose. Sheriff Bradley checked his rifle, the metal clicking with ominous finality. How many escape routes do we have from here? 3, Hope replied immediately. The main trail they're coming up, the back way we used last night, and a narrow path that leads down to the creek bed. But the creek path is dangerous. One wrong step and you fall 100 feet onto rocks. 4 people, defending against a dozen or more, isn't good odds, Sarah said quietly. Maybe we should consider negotiation with a man who's been murdering his own family members for 15 years. Maddox shook his head grimly. There's no negotiating with someone who's already decided you need to die. The sound of approaching horses was getting closer, accompanied now by voices calling out with false friendliness. Hayes, or Edmund Ashworth as they now knew him, was apparently still trying to maintain his civilized facade even as he closed in for the kill. Girls, Grace called softly, we need to get to the mine shaft. Whatever evidence Papa left there might be our only chance of surviving this. But as they prepared to leave the administrative building, Hope spotted something that made her freeze in the doorway. Look at the riders. The ones in front. Maddox followed her gaze and felt his blood turn cold. Leading the approaching group wasn't just Hayes and Blackwood, it was Vernon Kemp, wearing a federal marshal's badge that gleamed in the morning sunlight. "Son of a bitch has been working with them all along," Bradley whispered. "That's why the federal marshals got here so fast. Kemp's been feeding them information from the beginning." The betrayal cut deeper than any of them had expected. Kemp had been present for every conversation, privy to every plan, positioned to anticipate their every move. Their desperate flight to the mining camp hadn't been an escape. It had been a carefully orchestrated trap designed to isolate them where no witnesses could interfere with whatever Hayes had planned. But remember, their father's letter concluded, "You are Ashworth blood, and we do not surrender to evil men simply because they wear badges or carry legal papers. Sometimes the only way to serve justice is to force wicked people to face the consequences of their choices." As the approaching riders spread out to surround the camp, cutting off escape routes with military precision, Grace and Hope exchanged a look that spoke of shared resolve and desperate courage. "Papa left us more than evidence," Grace said quietly, producing a small key from beneath her dress. "He left us the means to make sure the truth doesn't die with us." Before anyone could ask what she meant, the sound of horses entering the camp courtyard announced that their time for planning had run out. Hayes's voice carried clearly across the morning air, still maintaining its professional courtesy despite the obvious threat. "Good morning. We know you're in there, and we're here to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to this unfortunate situation." Maddox checked his weapons one final time. The weight of his father's saber, a comforting presence at his side. Whatever was about to happen, they would face it on their feet, fighting for truth against men who'd chosen to serve greed instead of justice. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the stakes had just become higher than anyone had imagined. The telegraph message had arrived at dawn, crackling across the wires from Santa Fe with the urgency of salvation itself. Judge Harrison's response to their desperate communication was brief, but filled with hope. "Federal investigation authorized. Territorial marshals en route. Hold position. Justice comes." Sarah Mitchell folded the precious paper carefully, tucking it inside her jacket as she rejoined the others in the mining camp's main building. "Help is coming, but it'll be at least 6 hours before the real federal marshals can reach us." 6 hours, Sheriff Bradley repeated grimly, peering through a gap in the boarded windows at the men surrounding their position. "Might as well be 6 days, considering what we're facing." Hayes and his assembled force had positioned themselves with military precision around the camp's perimeter. Through Maddox's field glasses, he could count at least 15 armed men, all carrying themselves with the professional competence of hired gunfighters rather than legitimate law enforcement. Vernon Kemp's betrayal had given them intimate knowledge of the camp's layout and defensive positions, turning what should have been an advantage into a carefully prepared trap. "They're in no hurry," Maddox observed, watching the methodical way Hayes's men were establishing their positions. "They know we're not going anywhere, and they want to make sure no witnesses escape to tell tales." Grace and Hope had spent the early morning hours preparing for what might be their final hours, transforming themselves from frightened children into young women ready to honor their family's legacy. Both wore their silver lockets prominently, the miniature portraits of their mother serving as talismans against the evil that had destroyed so much of their family. "The mine shaft," Hope said quietly, studying her father's detailed map of the camp's underground passages. "Papa showed us a way through the old tunnels that connects to the creek bed a mile downstream. If we can reach it, we might be able to get word to Judge Harrison's marshals when they arrive." "And if they catch us trying to escape?" Mrs. Patterson asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Then we make sure they pay a price they won't forget," Grace replied with quiet determination. From beneath her dress, she produced a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Her father's backup documentation, including detailed maps of the mineral, deposits and copies of all correspondence with territorial authorities. Papa always said the truth was more powerful than bullets, but sometimes you needed bullets to protect the truth long enough for it to matter. Maddox felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The pre-battle tension he remembered from his years guiding wagon trains through hostile territory. But this was different, more personal, more desperate. These weren't random hostiles looking for easy plunder. These were family members turned murderous, using the law itself as a weapon against innocence. "Sarah," he said quietly, "you still have time to surrender. Walk out there and tell them you were just trying to help, that you didn't know the full situation. They might let you go." The schoolteacher's laugh held no humor. "Mr. Thorne, I've spent 3 years teaching frontier children that education and courage can overcome any obstacle. I'm not about to abandon that lesson when it matters most." Outside, Hayes's voice carried across the compound with false reasonableness. "We know you're listening. There's no need for anyone to get hurt here. We're prepared to offer very generous terms for a peaceful resolution." Sheriff Bradley spat into the dust. "Generous terms, right up until the moment we sign whatever papers they've brought, then we all have tragic accidents." "That's exactly what they're planning," Hope confirmed, her young face set with grim understanding. "Papa's letter made it clear. Uncle Edmund can't afford to leave any witnesses who know the truth about what he's done." The morning sun was climbing toward its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the camp's weathered buildings. Maddox could see Hayes's men growing restless, their professional patience wearing thin as they waited for orders to move. Whatever ultimatum was coming, it wouldn't be long in arriving. "Ladies," he said, turning to address Grace and Hope directly, "your father trusted me to keep you safe, and I intend to honor that trust. But I need you to promise me something." Both girls looked at him with eyes that seemed far too old for their faces. "If things go bad, if it looks like we can't hold them off, you take that evidence and you run for the mineshaft. Don't look back. Don't try to help us. Just get to Judge Harrison's marshals and make sure the truth gets told." "We're not leaving you," Grace said firmly. "We've lost too many people already. And we're not going to lose any more if we can help it," Hope added. "But we're also not going to dishonor Papa's memory by dying uselessly when we could be fighting." Mrs. Patterson was checking the camp's water supply and remaining ammunition, her movements efficient despite the obvious strain of their situation. "We've got enough food for maybe 2 days, but water's going to be a problem if they decide to wait us out." "They won't wait," Maddox said with certainty. "Too much risk that real federal marshals might show up and start asking uncomfortable questions. Hayes will move soon, probably within the next hour." As if summoned by his words, Vernon Kemp's voice boomed across the compound. "Thorne, you and those girls come out now, and maybe we can work something out. Keep playing games and things are going to get unpleasant for everyone." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Kemp had sat on Mrs. Patterson's porch, shared coffee, and conversation, presented himself as a pillar of the community while secretly feeding information to men who'd been murdering children for inheritance money. "Answer him," Grace suggested quietly, "but let them know we understand exactly who they are and what they want." Maddox moved to the window, keeping his rifle ready but visible. "Kemp, got to say I'm disappointed. Figured you for a lot of things, but never took you for the kind of man who'd sell out children for money." "Money?" Kemp's laugh was bitter. "Boy, you don't understand the first thing about what's happening here. This is about justice, about making sure valuable resources don't get wasted on a pair of vagrant orphans who don't know their place in the world." "Their place?" Sarah called out, her teacher's voice carrying clearly across the compound. "You mean their place as the rightful heirs to their family's fortune?" The silence that followed was telling. Hayes and his men had probably hoped to maintain their legal fiction until the very end, but now they were faced with the reality that their targets knew exactly what was at stake. "Miss Mitchell," Hayes's voice was silk wrapped around steel, "I'm afraid you've been misinformed about the legal realities of this situation. Perhaps if you join us, we could clarify some of the complexities you might not understand." "I understand plenty," Sarah replied. "I understand that you're not a lawyer named Edmund Hayes. I understand that you're Edmund Ashworth, presumed dead for 15 years while you've been murdering your own family members. And I understand that federal marshals are already investigating your activities." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The careful positioning of Hayes's men shifted suddenly, weapons coming up in a way that spoke of orders received and violence authorized. Whatever pretense of civilized negotiation they'd maintained was over. "That was unwise, Miss Mitchell," Hayes called out, his voice now cold with unveiled threat. "You've forced us to accelerate our timeline considerably." Hope was at the back window, studying the terrain between their position and the mineshaft entrance. "Papa always said, when cornered animals get desperate, they make mistakes. Maybe we can use their hurry against them." "What are you thinking?" Maddox asked. "The mineshaft has multiple entrances, but they only know about the main one because that's what Papa showed everyone. There's a ventilation shaft 50 yards behind the assay office that connects to the same tunnel system." Grace was nodding, following her sister's tactical reasoning. "If we can create enough distraction at the main entrance, one of us might be able to slip out through the ventilation shaft and reach the evidence chamber." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. Outside, Hayes's men were moving into assault positions with professional efficiency. The time for negotiation and strategic thinking was over. Sheriff Bradley checked his ammunition one final time. "Whatever we're going to do, we better do it soon. They're about to come calling, and I don't think they're planning on knocking first." Maddox felt the weight of his father's cavalry saber at his side, the steel warming under his palm like a living thing. Captain William Thorne had carried this weapon through impossible odds, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, standing firm when retreat would have been easier. Today, his son would honor that legacy. "All right," Maddox said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd found his purpose. "Let's show these murderers what happens when they mistake mercy for weakness." The final battle for the twins' lives and their families' justice was about to begin. The signed confession lay spread across Judge Harrison's field desk like a roadmap to justice, its pages covered with Edmund Ashworth's careful handwriting as he detailed 15 years of calculated murder and theft. The federal marshals had arrived with the judge in force, 12. Seasoned lawmen who'd surrounded Hayes's position with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood the difference between justice and vengeance. "It's over." "Edmund," Judge Harrison called across the mining camp's courtyard, his voice carrying the authority of legitimate law enforcement. "Your men are outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, and we can settle this without more bloodshed." The confrontation had reached its crescendo just as Maddox feared it would, with desperate men making desperate choices. Hayes's assault on the mining camp buildings had been repelled, but at a cost that weighed heavily on everyone who'd survived it. Vernon Kemp lay dead in the dust, his betrayal earning him a bullet from one of his own supposed allies when he'd tried to switch sides at the last moment. 2 of Hayes's hired gunfighters had fallen to Sheriff Bradley's rifle, while a third nursed a wounded arm behind an overturned wagon. But the real victory had come from Grace's courage and Hope's tactical brilliance. While the adults had held the main building against the initial assault, both girls had slipped through the ventilation shaft system and reached their father's hidden cache of evidence. More than just maps and mineral surveys, they'd discovered a comprehensive record of Edmund Ashworth's crimes, correspondence with criminal associates, financial documents showing payments to assassins, and most damning of all, a detailed confession he'd apparently written as insurance against his own partners, Uncle Edmund. Grace's voice carried clearly across the compound as she emerged from the mineshaft entrance, her father's evidence box cradled carefully in her arms. "Papa left something for you." The effect on Hayes was immediate and visceral. His carefully maintained composure cracked like thin ice, revealing the desperate killer beneath the civilized facade. "You don't understand what you're doing, child. That documentation could destabilize mineral rights across 3 territories." "No," Hope corrected, appearing beside her sister with identical determination. It's going to make sure the people you murdered get justice, and the communities you've been cheating get what belongs to them." Judge Harrison dismounted from his horse slowly, his weathered face showing both satisfaction and profound sadness. He'd known the Ashworth family before Charlotte's marriage, had watched them build something meaningful in the harsh territory, and had mourned their apparent misfortunes without realizing they were victims of systematic murder. "Edmund Ashworth," the judge said formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, theft of mineral rights, and corruption of federal law enforcement. Your associates are similarly charged, but Hayes wasn't finished. Desperate men in impossible situations often chose to take others down with them, rather than face justice alone." His hand moved toward the concealed weapon Maddox had spotted earlier, the small pistol that represented one last chance to eliminate the witnesses who could destroy him. "If I can't have the inheritance," Hayes snarled, his mask of civility finally stripped away completely, "then no one will." The shot rang out across the mountain air with the finality of thunder, but it wasn't Hayes who fired. Mrs. Patterson stood in the doorway of the main building, smoking derringer still steady in her hands, her face set with the grim satisfaction of a woman who'd protected children from a monster. "Some threats," she said quietly, "don't deserve second chances." Hayes crumpled to the dust. His schemes and murders finally ended by the courage of people who'd chosen to stand up for what was right instead of what was profitable. The hired gunfighters who'd survived the confrontation surrendered without further resistance, their loyalty to their dead employer extending only as far as their next paycheck. In the aftermath, as federal marshals secured the scene and began the process of documenting evidence that would reshape territorial law enforcement, the small group that had fought so desperately for justice finally had time to process what they'd accomplished. The confession mentions other victims, Sarah Mitchell reported, studying the documents they'd recovered. Families across Colorado and Wyoming who died in accidents that weren't accidents at all. "This evidence will help solve murders that have been cold cases for years." Sheriff Bradley nodded grimly as he helped load the wounded onto makeshift stretchers. "And it'll expose the network of corrupt officials who've been helping him. This goes deeper than any of us realized." Grace and Hope stood together at the mine shaft entrance, looking out over the mountain landscape their father had loved and died protecting. Both wore their mother's lockets openly now, no longer symbols of hidden identity, but declarations of proud heritage reclaimed. "Papa would be pleased," Grace said softly. "Mama too," Hope agreed. "They can finally rest knowing the truth came out and justice got served." Judge Harrison approached the twins with documents that would formally recognize their inheritance and establish proper legal guardianship. But more importantly, he carried news that would reshape their futures in ways none of them had anticipated. "Young ladies," he said gently, "there's something else your father's evidence revealed. Something that's going to make your futures very different from what any of us expected." The girls' original birth certificates were pristine despite their age, sealed in a metal document case that had protected them from decades of mountain weather. Judge Harrison spread them carefully on the camp table, the official seals and elaborate calligraphy, speaking of a time when such documents represented more than mere identification. They were declarations of identity, heritage and legal standing that could reshape entire futures. "Charlotte Grace Ashworth and Hope Eleanor Ashworth," the judge read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. "Born Richmond, Virginia, daughters of Charlotte Elizabeth Ashworth and Thomas William Ashworth, with legal claim to all properties, mineral rights, and financial assets of the Ashworth family estate." But it was the additional documentation that took everyone's breath away. Beneath the birth certificates lay property deeds, stock certificates, and bank authorizations that painted a picture of wealth so vast it defied comprehension. "Your mother's family," Judge Harrison explained gently, "owned more than mining rights. They held railroad stock, timber rights across Oregon and Washington territories, shipping interests in San Francisco, and banking partnerships that extend all the way to New York City. Grace and Hope exchanged glances that spoke of children trying to process information that would challenge seasoned businessmen. The inheritance they'd been fighting to protect was far larger than anyone had imagined, not just the mining claims and trust fund, but a financial empire that made them among the wealthiest individuals in the American West. How much? Sheriff Bradley asked quietly. Judge Harrison consulted his notes with the careful precision of a man delivering life-changing news. Conservative estimates place the total value at just over $2 million. But if the mineral surveys your father completed are accurate, the final figure could reach $5 million or more. The sum was almost incomprehensible. $2 million was more money than most frontier towns saw in a decade, enough to fund universities, build railroads, or transform entire territories. And it belonged to two young girls who'd been sleeping in a boarding house and mending their own clothes just days before. The legal implications are significant, Judge Harrison continued. Your inheritance includes controlling interests in several major territorial businesses, which means your decisions will affect thousands of workers and their families. More importantly, your father's mineral surveys identify potential mining sites that could provide employment for entire communities. Maddox found himself studying the twins' faces, watching for signs that such overwhelming responsibility might crush spirits already tested by trauma and loss. But what he saw instead was the same quiet determination that had carried them through everything else, a recognition that great wealth brought great obligation, and a resolve to honor their parents' memory by using their inheritance wisely. What about the people Uncle Edmund hurt? Grace asked, her first concern characteristically focused on others rather than herself. Can we help make things right for their families? We can and we will, Judge Harrison assured her. The evidence you recovered will enable us to identify all of Edmund's victims and provide compensation to their survivors. Your inheritance is large enough to ensure justice without diminishing your own. Security. Hope was studying the mineral survey maps with the same tactical intelligence she'd shown during their desperate defense of the camp. Papa marked sites where mining could provide jobs without destroying the land. He always said wealth that came at the expense of the earth or its people wasn't really wealth at all. Sarah Mitchell had been taking notes throughout the conversation, her teacher's instincts engaged by the educational implications of such sudden transformation. The girls will need extensive tutoring in business management, legal procedures, and financial planning. This kind of wealth requires expertise they don't currently possess, which is why, Judge Harrison said, I'm recommending that Maddox Thorne be appointed as their legal guardian and estate manager, with Mrs. Patterson serving as their official chaperone and educational coordinator. The proposal struck Maddox like a physical blow. After years of considering himself a failure, a washed-up trail scout whose inability to protect his own family had rendered him useless. He was being offered the chance to guide two remarkable young women toward a future that could benefit thousands of people. I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that, he said. Quietly. Papa trusted you, Grace said firmly. That's qualification enough for us. And you've already proven you'll fight for what's right instead of what's profitable, Hope added. That's exactly the kind of man we need, helping us figure out how to use this inheritance properly. Mrs. Patterson was nodding her agreement, her practical nature already engaged by the logistical challenges ahead. They'll need a proper home, decent clothes, and education that prepares them for the responsibilities they're inheriting. But most importantly, they'll need people around them who remember that they're still children, regardless of how much money they're worth. As the federal marshals completed their work and prepared to transport their prisoners back to Denver for trial, the small group that had fought so desperately for justice found themselves contemplating a future none of them had imagined possible. The twins had not only survived their uncle's murderous schemes, they had emerged as powerful forces for positive Change in a territory that desperately needed the kind of thoughtful leadership their inheritance would make possible. Justice had been served, but more importantly, hope had been restored to a frontier community that had almost forgotten what it meant to stand up for what was right. The new family portrait sat prominently on the mantelpiece of the Ashworth house, its silver frame catching the afternoon light that streamed through windows that had been replaced with the finest glass money could buy. But the true beauty of the photograph lay not in its expensive frame, but in the faces it captured. Maddox Thorne standing proud and straight between Grace and Hope, with Mrs. Patterson seated beside them, all four wearing expressions of quiet contentment that spoke of battles won and families restored. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the mining camp. 6 months that had transformed not just the lives of those directly involved, but the entire character of Dry Creek and the surrounding territory. The Ashworth Foundation, established under Grace and Hope's direction with Maddox's guidance, had become a force for positive change that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. "The new school is nearly finished," Sarah Mitchell reported as she joined them for their weekly planning meeting. As the Foundation's first educational director, she'd overseen the construction of a proper schoolhouse that would serve children from 5 surrounding communities. "We'll be able to accommodate 60 students by the fall term, with provisions for boarding students from the more remote mining camps." Hope looked up from the correspondence she'd been reviewing, her penmanship now reflecting the intensive tutoring she and Grace had received in business management and formal education. At 14, she was already demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that would serve her well as one of the territory's most influential citizens. "What about the teacher housing?" she asked. "Papa always said that communities prospered when they could attract good teachers, but teachers needed decent places to live." 4 new cottages, all furnished and ready for occupancy, Sarah confirmed. "Plus we've received applications from teachers in Denver, Santa Fe, and even Chicago. Word is spreading that the Ashworth Foundation treats educators with respect and provides them with the resources they need to succeed." Grace was studying mining reports with the same careful attention their father had shown. Her understanding of geological surveys, now sophisticated enough to make informed decisions about which claims to develop and which to preserve for future generations. "The Bear Creek operation is producing exactly what Papa predicted," she announced. "Enough gold and silver to fund all our community projects, with minimal environmental impact thanks to the new extraction methods we're using." The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Under Maddox's protective guidance and Mrs. Patterson's practical management, both girls had grown into their roles as community leaders while somehow maintaining the essential qualities that had made them worth fighting for in the first place. They remained kind, thoughtful, and fiercely protective of those who couldn't protect themselves. "Speaking of protection," Maddox said, producing a letter that had arrived that morning, "Judge Harrison sends word that the last of Edmund's criminal associates has been sentenced." The corruption investigation identified 17 officials across 4 territories who were taking bribes to ignore suspicious deaths and manipulate property transfers. The justice that had begun with Mrs. Patterson's derringer had ultimately reached far beyond their specific case, cleaning out corruption that had plagued territorial law enforcement for years. But perhaps more importantly, it had demonstrated that ordinary people could successfully stand up to powerful interests when they refused to be intimidated. Mrs. Patterson looked up from the household accounts she'd been balancing, her role as the girls' official chaperone having evolved into something approaching family matriarch. "The Peterson family sends their thanks for the compensation you arranged," she reported. "Turns out their father's accidental death 3 years ago was another of Edmund's murders. But now they have enough money to keep their ranch and send their children to proper schools." It had become a pattern repeated dozens of times, families who'd suffered mysterious losses receiving both financial compensation and the closure that came with knowing the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. The Ashworth Foundation's Victim Assistance Program had become a model for how wealth could be used to heal communities rather than simply accumulate power. And the railway extension? Grace asked, turning to the infrastructure project that represented their most ambitious community investment. Approved by the territorial legislature, Maddox confirmed. The Denver and Rio Grande will extend their line to Dry Creek by next summer, which means regular mail service, passenger transportation, and freight delivery for the entire region. The railway would transform isolated mining communities into connected parts of the broader territory's economy, providing opportunities for trade, education, and cultural exchange that had been impossible when everything depended on difficult overland travel. As the afternoon meeting concluded and each member of their unusual family returned to their individual responsibilities, Maddox found himself reflecting on how profoundly his life had changed. The guilt that had consumed him since Mary's death had been replaced by purpose, the sense that his skills and experience were finally being used to protect and guide rather than simply to survive. Grace and Hope had grown into remarkable young women, their inheritance providing them not just with financial security, but with the means to honor their parents' memory through meaningful service to their community. They'd learned to balance the practical demands of managing vast wealth with the personal values that made such wealth worth having, the silver bridles that had first revealed their extraordinary abilities, now hung in places of honor in the stable that housed their growing collection of fine horses. But the girls rode them not for display or competition, but for the simple joy of partnership with magnificent animals that had always seemed to recognize something special in their young riders. As evening approached and the family gathered for dinner, in the dining room that had once belonged to their murdered relatives, the conversation flowed with the easy affection of people who'd chosen to become family despite sharing no blood ties. They discussed plans for new schools, mining operations that would provide jobs while preserving the land, and the railroad extension that would connect isolated communities to the wider world. But mostly, they simply enjoyed the rare luxury of peace, the knowledge that they'd fought for justice and won, that they'd protected innocence and seen it flourish, and that sometimes, in a harsh world that often rewarded cruelty over kindness, good people could prevail through courage, determination, and the refusal to surrender to evil, regardless of how powerful it seemed. The photograph on the mantelpiece captured more than just four faces smiling at a camera. It captured the triumph of love over loss, of chosen family over biological accident, and of hope over despair in a frontier territory that had learned to believe in second chances and the power of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things when they remembered what truly mattered.